Okay, welcome to Del Beccaro and Hook Enlightened Descent. I am Steve Hook. Normally, right now, you'd be seeing my wonderful co-host next to me on a side-by-side shot. You're going to see him in a minute because this show's a little bit different today. We're going to be actually interviewing my co-host, Tom Del Beccaro, and there he is now. Going to be talking all about Tom's latest book, and we look forward to it. Before we jump into that, let me just say this. Follow us at Del Beccaro and Hook on either Rumble or YouTube. Better yet, do both of them, Rumble and YouTube, at Del Beccaro and Hook. That's DelBeccaor and Hook. Pretty simple there. Anyway, Tom Del Beccaro, hello, sir. Good to see you again, buddy. How are you, man?
I'm doing great. A lively season as always. And although I didn't mean for my book to have a message so pertinent to this election, because obviously I started the book 8 years ago, writing it, researching it, for decades. It certainly has some pertinent lessons.
Well, it's funny you would say that, Tom, because that was going to be one of the first things I said to you. I remember well years ago when The Divided Era came out and you were on my old radio show, and I remember saying to you at that time, boy, this book couldn't be more prescient. It came out at the perfect time. And the same is true with the latest book, The Lessons of the American Civilization. It's very, very pertinent now. I think that's a great way to put it, because we're seeing what's happening there. And these are lessons that we're learning almost hour by hour today. So I kind of want to dive into it with you. First of all, it should be said, folks, that this book, just like The Divided Era, is not slapdash. It's not just thrown together to sell books. As Tom mentioned, he studied it. He educated himself with the history and all that. Of course, Tom, I'm not just trying to blow smoke, but you know your stuff, and it's obvious in the book. It's very apparent. So let's jump into it, because this is a book that I think that everyone should be reading. Tell us about the book. Why'd you publish it? Why did you feel the need to put this book out when you did right now?
Sure. My career hopefully has been about helping people put things in context, historical context, political context, the context of the moment. And so, like The Divided Era, I was trying to explain to people how we got to this situation of why we were so divided, and the fact that, importantly, that it wasn't the first time in history we were divided. I want people to understand, this phrase about history repeats itself, what we can learn from the past and hopefully apply it to the present, and more importantly, apply it to our policies going forward. And so, as you might remember, my father was involved in politics. I got involved with politics at a young age. At 10 years old, I was watching the TV shows on Sunday morning with my father. I was reading The Economist magazine, Foreign Affairs, and then I read, as a young teenager, Will and Ariel Durant's Story of Civilization. And what that does is explain how civilizations come together, rise and fall. And I've wanted to write this book, honestly, for decades. But not everybody reads a history book by a 16-year-old. So I waited a few years, and here I am. But there's some important lessons that maybe want to get it out this year in time for the election, so people can understand what's on the ballot this election. And of course, there's two names on the ballot, but there's also some significant issues that people should think about when they're voting.
Yeah. Well, the thing I love about the book, and just like The Divided Era, same story, is you use anecdotal snapshots through history to kind of explain where you're at. And as you mentioned, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. We've heard that one over and over again. It's cliche, but it's also true, which might help explain why some folks on the left don't want you to look at history, and they'd rather tear these statues down and just do away with stuff like, the Electoral College. But when you wrote, like Rome and ancient Greece before it, America has fallen into class warfare whose flames are fanned by ambitious politicians and media. That line jumped out at me because I think "and media" is absolutely relevant here. I've never seen the media in such a full court press to cover and carry the water for one side. And we're seeing that. Did we saw that in other civilizations going back many, many years, apparently, huh, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, at the beginning of a civilization, it's usually quite productive. America had a very productive phase where the economy was growing. We were self-reliant as a people, largely living on the farm. Of course, we're talking from the 1500s all the way into the 1800s, pre-industrialization. And America was started with and this becomes very important in several aspects, including the one which you mentioned. There is a relative equality of opportunity and wealth in America, probably more even than any place in history. And then we look at the phase we're in now, where the argument is about equality and politicians who fan the flames of class warfare. And of course, what that means is pitting one class against another. In history, this happens post-industrialization. It doesn't really happen prior to that, where politicians arise and claim that there's the haves and the have-nots. Now, of course, when there's a king and not, there are people believe that, but there aren't free politicians in a freely elected government talking about it. And so America today has this situation, much like Greece towards, quite honestly, right before the fall of Greek democracy, right before the fall of the Roman Republic, I'm sorry to say, where politicians and their form of press fan these flames of haves and have-nots, and we've moved from a society that produces to a government that wants to redistribute, and in the process sets people against each other. That's always bad in history. You are always much better off when the economy is growing and people have a stake in their own future and feel like they have control of where they're going in life. And of course, it also happens when government gets so big that it squelches the economy. And America today is in a position where the government is so big, some 35% of the US economy, you throw in regulations, it hits in the 40s, where economic growth is very low and people don't feel in control. There's inflation, and these flames occur. Politicians take advantage of it. And then you mention the media. Now, for most of history, the media has been divided. It was divided when James Otis and Samuel Adams started this country with their fiery statements about the king. It was very divided and a lot of flames leading up to the Civil War. And we're here again today as one side, which controls, I'd say, the majority of the visual media, is very intent on pushing one side over the other, but they're also pushing this issue of class warfare so that the politicians, in this case on the left, can get elected. And it has very bad results in history, and we would be wise to understand that.
Yeah, and you mentioned the class warfare, and this, of course, plays this is their MO on the left. I mean, I'm not saying that it does that some of this identity politics doesn't happen on both sides. It does, to be fair, but not the way the left does it. The left actually pits groups of people. It's not just class warfare. Now it's sexual identity, it's race, it's ethnicity, it's religion, it's anything. Hell, these days, Tom, if you're seen waving an American flag, you're immediately thought of by those on the left, I should say. You're immediately thought of as some kind of white nationalist or something. I've never, ever seen the country as divided and angry, but I'm starting to get a sense, and you tell me if you're getting this as well, that the country is starting to coalesce around the idea that, guess what? This has been a bad few years. Do you think people are wisening up to it? Are people seeing through the division, the identity politics, the class warfare, and all that goes with it? Are people starting to wake up to that, do you think? You get that sense?
Well, certainly some are seeing that government, and this has always been true in history, once big government takes a major role in the economy, it tends to fail. And people are seeing that they don't have the same opportunity, and they see that the divisive politicians selling class warfare isn't providing anything to them. Today, if you look at, there was a recent poll by Quinnipiac saying that the Latino vote is 52 to 46 over Trump over Harris, which would be stunning. Black men are supporting the Republican in numbers never seen before. And that's because the economy is not producing results, and the politicians aren't either. Politicians can't produce results. This notion in this particular election that government can build the middle class. Government has never built an economy that has created a middle class. Only the private sector growth, high growth rates, has drawn people into a middle class like America did in the 1800s and into the 1900s. Government has killed off the economy and redistributed poverty in history, but it doesn't create a middle class. And so what you're seeing today is a frustration for certain sectors. Now, this comes and goes. On the left, however, there is still this notion that government through social justice can improve people's lives, and it can on the margin here and there. But by and large, what matters in history is economic growth and opportunity, and people who have control over their own economic future. And the larger government gets, and this is one of the lessons in the book I talk about, the larger government gets, the lower economic opportunity becomes, the more divisive a civilization.
Well, you know what? Let's drill into that a little bit, because you say in the book, you says, always and everywhere, power tends to centralize over time. And despite the founder's genius, the law of history is now on stunning display in America. You're not kidding. Boy, that's a mouthful, but it's also true. We are seeing this. And the division is, I think that they pushed a little bit too hard on the identity politics, because all of a sudden people are saying, wait a minute, you're playing me as a dupe. And I mean, I don't even know if you watched the interview with the speech that Kamala gave, where it was supposed to be her big coming out speech on her economic plan. Did you watch any of that? That was littered with examples of class warfare and class envy. And Trump one thing that she said was that Trump wants to be the tariff president. I want to be whatever the hell she said. But the reason I mention that is because every single Trump tariff on China is still in place. They have removed none of them. And now they're trying to tar Trump with this tariff notion when they're keeping all of those tariffs in place. Pretty stunning.
Yeah. So history is pretty clear. Governments start out small and relatively decentralized, at least elected governments. And then this law of history, you mentioned that power centralizes over time. That process continues. And so what you had in America was, our founders understood this. They had studied Rome. They had studied Greece. They had just come from a very centralized government, England. They fought to get away from that. So they created these three branches. They didn't want a centralized big government in the capital. No, instead, they wanted it to reside within the states. The states were fairly evenly balanced. Virginia, yes, was bigger than everyone else economically and politically, and so too eventually New York. But Virginia didn't have much weight over, say, Georgia, because they were in different parts of the country, and there was no centralized power to emphasize Virginia over Georgia or South Carolina. So the point being that it was evenly spread, and that's where freedom can exist best, when the economic and political power are evened out and there is no good big central power. Now, what I do in chapter 10 of the book, it's called America, Capitalism, and Socialism, is demonstrate how over the centuries since we started, power accumulated in Washington, D.C. I hate using George Washington's name this way because it's not what he wanted, but how it accumulated in the nation's capital. And you can just watch this occur because every dollar spent in Washington, D.C. is a form of accumulated power. And now Washington, D.C. directs so much. And the problem when that becomes multiple. First and foremost, of course, you have a lesser say. Bigger government does bigger deals with really big entities, whether it be McDonnell Douglas in defense or Pfizer when it came to COVID. Let's face it, Pfizer and Moderna had a bigger say in American politics and policy than any group of citizens. And that's because big government makes these big deals. And that's true on both sides. This isn't a criticism of one party over the other, but governments in America are handing out $10 trillion a year, and the average citizen gets the least of it, whereas big companies, big public employee unions, and others get a lot of it. And that's anti-democratic by nature because my vote doesn't give me that kind of power or that kind of access or that kind of money. Beyond that, the other real danger, which I cover in the book, is what we see today, which is that once people get power, they don't want to give it up, and they begin to protect themselves from the U.S. citizen. And that's what you're seeing in such spades today. They have this power. It's big business to them. 9 of the 20 richest counties surround Washington, D.C. They want our money for that business, but they don't want our 2 cents. And so what you get is this situation where they literally protect themselves from those who would interrupt their power. And a great deal of what you're seeing with the objection and the fight and worse to stop Donald Trump is that he wants to devolve power away from them, or he's not within their power sphere. So there's this big pushback. And of course, that's stunningly anti-democratic as well, small d, meaning that's the exact opposite what our founders wanted. They wanted the individual states to be powerful, to people have direct redress of their government where they could talk to the local officials and freedom could reign. And that becomes very dangerous. Bigger government is by definition authoritarian. Smaller government is less authoritarian on balance. And so these elections, if you're favoring more power in Washington, D.C., regardless of the the party, you are favoring this authoritarian, and it's very dangerous for America.
It's very dangerous, and not only well said, but I mean, and this is where the media, and especially in this era, we have social media that 30 years ago didn't exist. Well, now it does. Now we've seen what big government does with social media, don't we? The Twitter files exposed a lot of this. Zuckerberg has exposed a lot of this. The government puts the thumb on the scale. And then, by the way, if I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second, what they would say is, this is why capitalism doesn't work. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is not capitalism, what we're seeing. This is corporatism. You could make a case that it's some crony capitalism, but it affects everybody in government. These big, you mentioned Pfizer, so we'll just go with Pfizer. Huge lobbying arm for pharma, a huge lobbying arm, billions and billions and billions of dollars at stake. Then you throw in the media, whose number one advertiser, is Pfizer. Now you wonder, that's not capitalism, though, is it, Tom? That's corporatism, and the government and the certain people in the government and a good chunk of the media is leaning way into that because they want that money.
Yeah, this is what we're talking about, this relationship between really big government and really big, whether it's public employee unions or corporations. Milton Friedman used to talk about that he didn't favor big business, he favored free enterprise. And what he meant by that was he favored a market where people could compete. he didn't like the way big business got into bed with big government and set the rules. And by doing that, they limited the ability of others to get in the market. And then the market got smaller because bigger corporations had so much power along with big government. And in the process, they undermined the democratic ideal of the power of the vote. They undermine any republic because instead of citizens voting for representatives that represent their interests, as you point out, these big corporations therefore drive politicians to undertake certain policies. So one of the most important lessons of the book that applies to today and going forward is that America has reached such a point in its history where there is such a large government that it squelches economic growth, which lowers standards of living and forces people often onto welfare and causes the inflation we have now, running big deficits and national debt. But also the centralization leads to this centralization of power, which by definition is anti-free election. And we would do well to watch that going forward because civilizations decline under centralized governments.
Yeah. And, you know, the lesson I take from a lot of it, Tom, is the very same people that are pushing for this more centralized government have this fanciful idea that big government is benevolent. But, and here's the big caveat, but only if we control it. The other guy is a threat to democracy. He's an existential threat to our very freedoms, and he must be extinguished permanently, I think was what the Commerce Secretary said yesterday on MSNBC. That's nice. So big government is beneficial to those in the government, not so much to the rest of us peons that are just looking, you know, squirrels looking for nuts. And so what they do is they centralize their power and they say, we're going to do it all for you. And we're going to do it bigger, better, and build back better and whatever they use. Meanwhile, them and the fat cats and some of these big corporate interests are just gleefully rolling around in filthy lucre that is taken from taxpayers. And I've never seen a corporation have such an effect on American politics. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Tom, but you mentioned Pfizer. We could go Moderna as well. I have never seen a private sector corporation have such a direct impact on American policy as we saw over the lockdowns and the vaccines and all that.
You're right, and that couldn't occur but for a powerful centralized government. And maybe on the other side, we can pick up the other side of this break. We can pick up about the strain you were talking about, which was the fact that those who claim to want to save democracy are actually those who are the most danger to democracy.
There you go. Okay, well, listen, we're speaking with Tom Del Beccaro and the new book, The Lessons of the American Civilization, on Del Beccaro and Hook, Enlightened Dissent. We take a short break. We come back and we dive into some more meaty issues with our guest and co-host, Tom Del Beccaro, right after this. And we're back with Del Beccaro and Hook, Enlightened Dissent. I'm Steve Hook. Here's Tom Del Beccaro. You just saw an ad for his book. Tom, let's talk about the book some more. And before we do, tell us where we can get The Lessons of the American Civilization. Where can our listeners and viewers go grab a copy?
Sure, they can get it here. I was about to put one in front of the camera. They can get it at tomdel.com. That's TOMDEL.com. Of course, you can get it at Amazon, online, Barnes & Noble, even Target, or just Google The Lessons of the American Civilization, and you can pick up a copy. You know, in our last segment, you mentioned something very important, and I cover it at length in the book, which is this idea of those claiming to be protectors of the republic or democratic ideals uh, say that the other guy is the danger. And history is absolutely replete with examples of those in power claiming their opponent is the risk while they're here to save the republic. I actually, you'll go all. A great example is Venice in the early 1300s, where there was uh, a uh, a challenge to those in power, and what they did in response was create the what was called the Council of Ten, which became a very centralized manner of running the republic. And they also created a spy network because they were alarmed that they didn't know this challenge could arise without them knowing every detail in advance. And so they created what is the forerunner to the American FBI and all of the spy networks in the West, and stopped challenges. And they created this in the name of the stability of the republic. This is good for the republic because it will keep the republic stable. And you heard in the last several years this talk about, not even more than several years, about how the Trump candidacy is a threat to the republic because, quote, he's the authoritarian. And then, of course, what is their cure for this? Well, they want you to give up a little bit of power to them so that they can secure the republic. It's the same thing. It has happened countless times. I mean, keep in mind the end of the Roman Republic, which happened during class warfare. There were assassinations of the rivals to power, and it ended with becoming an emperor, in effect, a Caesar, saying that for the good of the country, we have to stop this democracy/republic thing. Now, obviously, I'm paraphrasing. But what did people like Franklin say? He said those who give up freedom in exchange for security wind up with neither. And that's what's going on here in America. You have those in power saying that for the good of the country, you have to give up a little bit of power. You have to be willing to let us squelch dissent like they did on Facebook. You can only listen to us when it comes to COVID, even though there's great evidence to show that, in fact, most of the disinformation came out of government because they wouldn't listen to somebody other than Anthony Fauci, who was making money. The importance of all of this is that this is not a new dynamic in history, and this is why I wanted this book out here, so that people understand and can spot these things and think objectively about them and make better decisions going forward.
Yeah. Here. The people, in order to save the republic, we've got to trash the Electoral College. We've got to pack the Supreme Court. We've got to put Trump in prison. We need more of your money. We need to open the borders up. I mean, it really is. It beggars belief that anyone buys into this. But as you know, on the flip side, the reason that we're seeing this, as you so rightly point out, is because this is the MO throughout history. You can go back to 1300s Italy. You can go back to even further back to ancient Rome. You mentioned ancient Greece. This is the kind of stuff they always do in order to save the republic and to save your liberty. You've got to surrender it. Now, I love that quote from Franklin you mentioned, Ben Franklin. Those who would surrender liberty for security deserve neither liberty or security. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I mean, goodness gracious, if you're ready to throw everybody else under the bus, what I'm wondering, Tom, is it seems that in the run up to this election, which I do truly believe is probably going to be the most consequential election, certainly in modern American history, if not all of American history. But in the run up to this, we see this grab of the centralized powers and a grab of all the levers of the social levers, be it social media, print media, old school mainstream media, and it seems to be backfiring this time. Did they overplay their hand this time, or are people starting to learn the lessons of the American civilization?
Well, I would say that several things occurred that made them want to push back. For the poor economy, inflation. Inflation has never gone well for the party in power. People push back because inflation robs them. People in the United States today have 20 some percent less than they other purchasing power than they did just 3 or 4 years ago. And that always evokes a strong response. The amount of crime, these are all occurring at the same time. So it agitates them. And remember that starting in the late 90s was this Tea Party movement, which at its core was this sentiment that government wasn't working for us, it was working for those in power. And quite honestly, that has happened many times in history. And that's where the Gracchi brothers in Rome came out of that same feeling back then. But in this particular case, what happened was that a political figure came along and harnessed that energy, called it draining the swamp, and he was opposed by even members of his own party because, and famously, Republicans said, like Mitch McConnell, don't use that phrase, drain the swamp. Well, okay, at what level should government spending be if it's already at 35% and you guys are all making this much money and the economy has been stagnated? The biggest cause to the stagnation to the economy isn't that somebody's a billionaire. It is that government imposes so many restrictions and taxes that you don't have the growth that you had during the 1800s and into the 1900s that created the middle class. So all of these things are coming together. A strong economy would reduce some of this, certainly a lot of this anger. A nation is easier unified during economic strength than it is during economic weakness. And if the economy got on a good track again for numerous years, we would be less divisive. Then you have to ask the question, well, wouldn't the march of centralized government continue thereafter? And of course, that is the question.
Yeah, that's a question that we're all facing right now. And I think that is exactly, we're on the knife's edge of finding the answer to that question out, aren't we, with this election? I do find it a little bit funny. I've often said if the left didn't have double standards, they'd have no standards at all. But it is amusing to watch the pivot from the Democrats in the last decade or so, especially in the last 4 years under Biden. They keep pointing to the stock market and say, look how great it's doing. Hell, 10 years ago, they would have pointed to the stock market if it was doing good and say, look at all these fat cats getting rich while you're sucking eggs at home and you can barely afford to put gas in your car. So now the same exact people are pointing to the stock market while everybody else is sucking eggs trying to afford to put gas in their car. Pretty astonishing.
Yes, and of course, it's centralized government that's keeping the economy and the stock market afloat, because the manner in which these deficits are being fostered is through the central government injecting money into big banks and Wall Street, and therefore it does better than it otherwise would, but that doesn't reach down to Main Street. What matters to Main Street is price stability and a job with a productive future where you can get ahead. And governments cannot provide that dynamic. I talk about one of the lessons I talk about in the book is the effect government has on the economy. How it fostered the economy in the 1800s, how it is reducing the opportunities available to people currently. That's why I have to laugh when you hear a politician say something like, I want to create an opportunity economy. Well, you either allow for limited government and less restrictions to create economic growth, which creates opportunity, or you have a big government, which is the sworn enemy of opportunity, economic opportunity. And that's where we are today.
I'm so glad that you brought that up because that's absolutely so spot on. And I'll give you an example of this during the Trump era, during the Trump administration, first term, hopefully first of two. He created opportunity zones in urban cities, urban centers around the country. Those opportunity zones were not the government putting their finger on the scale. Those opportunity zones were created by slashing regulations, giving people tax incentives to open businesses. That's a wholly different kettle of fish than somebody saying on the other side, we're going to determine the winners and losers. We're going to determine equity. It's no longer equality, it's equity, equal outcome. That, whenever I hear that equity word, I get a little bit nervous. But I do know you laugh at people saying we're going to be opportunity, and I get that. But didn't opportunity zones, the plan that Trump put into place, that bore fruit? And that was not the heavy hand of government. If anything, it was the lessening, the lessening of the grip of government in these cities.
Yeah, again, my chapter, America, Capitalism, and Socialism. America had its productive phase in the late 1700s into the about 1950, and there was very limited government. If you look at the size of government during the height of industrialization, say 1900, it was only about 9 to 10% of the economy, and there was explosive economic growth after this, from the time of the end of the Civil War to the 1900, the economy grew some 400%. Imagine if it did that over a 20-some year period today. And while it grew, by the way, there was immense immigration, and the solution to class warfare is always economic growth. And when you don't have economic growth, then immigration always becomes an argument in history, especially American history. But the point was, as you describe, if there is limited government, you're going to have more economic growth. People should study the history of Singapore to find out that there was almost no government involved when it started. It was just a trading post on an island. Now, government eventually came into play, but it had explosive growth because of how limited government was. This is true throughout all of history. And the problem today is that we've gone past the proper balance. Just as you can have tax rates so high that it creates disincentives, right now there's so much government and so many regulations that there's disincentives, so growth slows. So the idea that Kamala Harris, who has only ever worked in government, except for maybe McDonald's, she says, who has only ever worked in government and only sees a government lever to pull, is the opposite of the lessons of history. In very simple terms, the more something costs, the less of it you get. That applies to a pair of jeans. But Bentley sells less cars than Ford on price, not on quality, right? And so that's true of the economy as a whole and employees. If they cost too much to do business in America, people move it somewhere else. And there has to be a better balance. And we, in this country, in plain economic terms, the balance has been lost. Economic growth is around 1.8% on average, where it was 4 to 5% on average prior to 1950. And if we don't get back to those higher growth rates, all sorts of problems occur, including the class warfare we've discussed.
Yeah, it's like It's like my buddy says, a self-licking ice cream cone. They've kind of created this monster that now can only be fed with government largesse, and that very government largesse is the problem to begin with. And it's time that we cut away from that. I certainly do hope that people are learning these. This book is called the lessons in the American civilization. It could just be called the lessons of civilization, because you really do. I mean, hell, man, you're mentioning Singapore, for God's sakes, ancient Greece, Rome. We could probably go back and talk about Sparta. I'm sure you have some lessons there. But the point is human nature over the years hasn't changed. And when you see someone that is basically saying, as you mentioned earlier, give up some of this and we'll give you all of that. That's a million red flags popping up for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And America became exceptional because it rejected that thinking of centralized government. And while we're on that topic, of course, one of the lessons, I think the second lesson in the book relates to American exceptionalism, which, look, to be exceptional means you did something as compared to something else. The great Thomas Sowell says, always ask compared to what? And the reason why America was exceptional is because at its founding, of course, remember, in 1776 to 1789, there was no working republic or democracy in the world. They created this on a piece of paper. There was no drugstore to go buy a pocket constitution to apply to what existed in America. And they created the broadest franchise, meaning the most voter participation in government in history during that period of time. Now, was it perfect? No, the human experience is not perfect. Did it include everyone? No, but it included more than anywhere else in history. And over time, that has expanded. I go in great length in this book about the times that it expanded, how Jefferson expanded it, how Andrew Jackson expanded it, how the Lincoln and the Civil War and the amendments to the Constitution and civil rights laws expanded it, how it finally was expanded with respect to women gaining the right to vote. Look, the formation of freedom is never perfect to begin with. It is an ongoing process, just as civilizations are. So what made America exceptional was that more than any place else in history, it provided for voter input and economic opportunity because of the freedom that existed, the limited government. And that was its successful model. When you take those things away by creating centralized governments, that's when America will go in. That is causing America to have symptoms of decline. And if we want America to revive, it has to understand what made it exceptional and let it move forward. I realize we're coming to the end of the show. Again, the book, you can get it at tomdel.com, TOMDEL.com, or you can get it at Amazon or Barnes & Noble, even Target. And why I wrote this book was to give people some perspective, to understand that these things have happened before, to be able to spot the signs of it and therefore make better future decisions.
Well, Tom, I want to thank you for a great conversation. I would just say one thing. We can go back to FDR era when he tried to blow up the Supreme Court, and he tried a whole bunch of, frankly, socialist ideas. They were rejected. They were rejected by a lot of people, even some in his own party, but they were rejected by the Republicans, and frankly, they were rejected by the people. But back then, people had civics, they had the understandings of civics. They knew our history. That's my big fear, that as government grows, it kind of puts its foot on any thought of history and tries to make you forget. Your book points it out brilliantly. Get it today, folks. It's a good one. Pass it around. When you're done with it, give it to someone else and let them, for Tom's benefit, buy them one. Otherwise, though, just loan it. The Lessons of the American Civilization by my great friend and co-host, Thomas Del Beccaro. Tom, God bless you, brother. Thank you thank you for joining me as a guest today on Del Beccaro and Hook. Remember to follow us on Rumble and YouTube. And remember to go get that book, The Lessons of the American Civilization. Anyway, Tom, anything else?
Nope, that's good. We'll see you next week. Thanks so much, everybody. And Steve, I'll see you soon.
Yes, you will. And congratulations, my friend. We'll see you very, very soon. Thank you for watching today. This is Steve Hook. He's Tom Del Beccaro. Until next time, goodbye.